Sean, we're the same generation, in theory, sharing a great-great-grandfather, but of course you're some years older than me, which meant you were lucky enough to experience the last few years of the British Empire and our first few years of independence. Days of what might be called spacious living. And perhaps the best position to be in at that time was that of a senior civil servant, or even better, the children of a senior civil servant, because you had enormous fun in the houses in which your father lived. So could you tell me something about them?
Yes, we, to an extent, I guess we realized we were living in momentous times, but we had no concept really of what it all meant, especially to our local people who had to take on a foreign culture, and it was that for them, and make it work in a whole new society. So it was quite a challenge, and we enjoyed it. They, I think, enjoyed it, but it happened quickly. I think we were very lucky compared with India. We didn't go through the turmoil that happened, and we didn't waste a lot of time doing this. We had a good, educated population, which India had a small segment, but it was not at the level of, I think we had 80% literacy at the time, which was just incredible. And so we were left, I think, of all the colonial situations that were happening at the time, I think we were left with the best package. And I think we did that very well.
I know your father at one point was Secretary of the Ministry of Education.
Yes.
Which was one of the most important areas to live in.
Yes, because we had to be sure that everybody was going now to get the same education. And English was not going to gallop away with all the prizes.
Right. Even though the politicians had taken several negative decisions.
Yes.
But I think at the time you studied, it was still English medium for you.
It was, yes. We never went through the Sinhalese medium.
No, I think the political decisions were going wrong at the time, but the hangover lasted for enough to give your generation, and to a lesser extent mine, although by then we had been cocooned in national languages for mediums of education. Mm-hmm. And although we had English, the rural areas lost it, although early on they'd had it. But really, instead of concentrating too much on politics, I want to also look at the personal. For instance, when your father was Secretary of Education, you probably had a wonderful house, a government house. Where did you live, for instance, in the period after independence?
Actually, that house still exists. It's a massive office complex now, but you will recognize it's 20 Reed Avenue.
Right.
It's right across the Reed Avenue from the racecourse.
Right.
And of course we had 8, 9, 10 rooms, a huge garden, half of which was eventually taken away and made into an Olympic swimming pool for Royal College.
Right,
that was
because
our
next
garden.
to Royal College, yes.
But what was so nice is that the whole British culture of race going came out of our house, because all of my father's friends, your father's friends, your parents' friends, they all trooped across the road, and we had a party every Saturday night.
After the races.
Wonderful. After the races, yeah.
Right. So these parties, were they for fellow civil servants, or were they relations? Were they personal friends? What was the social life like?
They shifted because they were race-going people.
Right.
And at my time, my father just took me along, and I was 12 years old, and I wasn't allowed to bet, but I went, and caroused with everybody else,
What fun that must have been.
It was, yes. And we went around with the British, we went along with the British concept of moving into Norelia when the weather was right.
Right, so that would be in April, the hot season in Colombo.
So
where did you stay there? Were there equally nice houses?
Well, they were gorgeous. This one that we stayed at, my father was senior, so he had first pick. And he picked the week when the races were happening. And there were 20 bedrooms.
Gosh.
Yes, and but no running water.
Right.
So that was kind of interesting because there we were, 20 people waiting to be washed and dressed and fed and eaten.
But staff to bring you water every morning.
Yes, they had these enormous porcelain bowls and pitchers. And I was told much later that if only we had known, those things were so rare that they would have been worth a fortune.
Yes, they must have been wonderful,
Yeah.
weren't they? And probably imported from maybe China, or was it Worcester?
I think it was Chinese or Russian.
So with 20 bedrooms, you invited your family and friends
Yes,
and everybody?
and then the Appu, you see, we had a train of servants.
Right.
And the Appu would come and he would be leading with the major cistern and the pitcher.
Right.
And I believe either we had to brush into that or we had to wash our face. But you did one or the other, and then the next one came along and gave you the towel, and you went on. And it was a ritual.
It must have been marvelous in those days.
Yes,
and
it
the
was.
food was very Western, I presume.
Oh,
up
my
there.
goodness.
But rice for lunch, but
Yeah, after the cleansing,
right.
we went off to lunch, and it was a huge lunch. It had every known Sri Lankan delicacy.
Right.
They must have been working all night.
Right.
And the 20 people were there all eating and everything. But we didn't actually overdo things because that was the meal for the day. Then everyone went off to the races and they ate what they were given, which were finger foods and things.
Right.
And then they came back late, and that was the part I liked best because everyone was happy, everyone was settled. The moon was shining over a lovely mountain, you know.
And you had wood fires, I presume.
And we had wood fires.
Must have been
And the
marvelous.
men would drink whiskey in their setting, and the women would drink sherry. And we had apple juice.
Right.
Yes,
Very British indeed.
very British indeed.
We've spoken so far, Shan, about accommodation that was official. Your father's house, your father's holiday homes. But I think those were also days of spacious living for private people. Mm-hmm. And I think your relations and mine, some of them common, had really palatial houses.
Yes, they did.
So could you describe one of them perhaps, and where you used to go for holidays, if that was it, as I did with my cousins?
Yes, now the house that we were given for everyday living had two large wings. The bedroom, I would say, that my parents had was about 3 times the size of this room.
Gosh.
And on the other side of the house, that was the room that I had as well, the same size. And it had its own little sitting room, each one of these. My brother had an apartment at the back, and that was a complete apartment with his own staircase that he could go down.
We've spoken so far, Shan, about what I might call official buildings, you know, your father's house, and then the holiday home that as a government official he could get. But I think those were days of gracious living in enormous houses, even by private people. Mm-hmm. You know, I remember the old place at Kurunagala where I used to stay, but I think you would have had similar houses for uncles and aunts and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. We had, and we called them, our name was Vikramasinghe, so it was Vikastan, Vikas this and Vikas that, and each knew which house belonged to whom, because we had tailored it. Yes.
So tell me about Vikastan, because I knew Wicklin, which was my
Yours,
great-grandparents' house.
Vikastan belonged to my uncle Sextus, and he was a stubby little man with a huge head of white hair, spoke like a bullet train, you know, in little sharp things. And he had 2 wives. He married 2 sisters. When one died, he married the other. But he had like 8 children who were amazing.
Yes, I knew the eldest,
Yes,
Auntie Norma.
Auntie Norma was just such a hoot. But anyway, those 8 daughters had to be married. And his house was on a hill. He wanted to invite 400 people to his wedding, to his daughter's wedding. He built a beautiful band shell that would play for the wedding. He brought in the peacocks. So
Peacocks?
that they, yes, he had peacocks. And then he reconfigured the hill so that it sort of led the fountains and the peacocks and the band shell to the top, where he was, of course, the king. And we had so many cousins, and they all had to be accommodated in the same place. Now, this was all the cultural stuff coming in. People over a certain age had their bedrooms, but that left a whole bunch of us who were underage and had no bedrooms. So my aunt Murray, who was a very careful woman.
Yes, I remember him. She's quite old when I was growing up, but yes.
Yeah, you wouldn't have known her. And
well.
she had these two huge corridors, which she divided. We had mats to sleep on because there
On
were two
balconies or on the ground floor?
on the ground floor.
Right.
Yeah, we had a whole corridor of mats for the boys and a whole corridor of mats for the girls.
Gosh.
And never the twain shall meet.
Right.
And Auntie Murray, who was about so high, had a huge bunch of keys because she didn't trust a soul. And she had cupboard after cupboard after cupboard of food, jewelry, heaven knows what. So Auntie Murray used to clank around the house. She had this huge bunch of keys. We used to call her Bancho.
Right.
And she clanked all around the house. And of course the boys on their mats on the floors were bound and determined to get into our corridor. But Auntie Murray sat in the middle. And she would not allow any interference, boys and girls.
She stayed up all night, or
She did, I think. Yeah, yeah.
or perhaps waited till you were all asleep.
Yeah.
No, that sounds absolutely marvelous. I never knew Uncle Sextus, but of
Yeah.
course I've known the daughters in later years.
Yes.
And they're all personalities.
They're all personalities of a kind, yes.
Because Sextus, if I've got it right, was your mother's brother.
Yes.
Yeah, because so in fact, his children would have been technically your aunts.
Yes, like little Chandi, who was
Yeah.
half my size but was my aunt.
Right.
And to
yes.
this day I call her Chandi.
Because of course your mother married quite young, so though
Yeah.
she was Sextus's cousin,
Yes.
you know, her children were coincided with his.
Yeah.
So that
But
was Sextus's house, which was, it was nowhere near Colombo, was it?
It was in Vellavath. Oh, no, that was in Kandy.
Wicklin was in Vellavath,
Yeah.
and I think
And Wicklin was.
So Sextus lived in Kandy.
Yeah.
Right.
Just outside. And now it's at Boston Institution.
Really? Oh, well, that's what
It's
it should have been
enormous
when all
house.
of you were there.
You're right, you're right.
But now, did you also have such spacious places by the sea?
Well, some did. This was an unrelated figure.
Mm-hmm.
My godfather, he happened to be Speaker of the House eventually, Shirley Correa.
Oh, I remember him when he was Speaker, but that was in the 60s.
Yeah.
Yes, lovely man.
But he and my father went to Cambridge together, and of course they were very good friends. So he was my godfather.
Right.
And he had, most of these families, big families, had ancestral mansions. That's what I'm describing to you. And Shirley had a house by the Gaul Sea.
Right.
And it was a big house, but when the winds blew, I just remember sand blowing into that house.
Really?
It had a library. I mean, you had yours in
Yeah, my grandfather
Lakmahan.
said, yeah.
But I think, if anything, his was even bigger. It was huge, but it was full of sand. He couldn't
books.
control it. The books and everything else, so nobody, could manage it, least of all himself. But I remember Bulldog Drummond, for instance. I used
Oh, it
to
was
read,
novels. My grandfather didn't have many novels, but
yeah,
you
Bulldog Drummond.
so Shirley used to read the thrillers
Yes.
of the 30s and
Of the
40s.
30s and the 40s, and I enjoyed them like you're enjoying some of my stuff.
Because Bulldog Drummond was, of course, in your mother's house in her library, which was doubtless yours many years past,
Yes.
in Roshanara, and I
Yes.
discovered Bulldog Drummond there. But you had discovered it much earlier.
From Shirley. And
From
I
your
think-
godfather.
From my godfather, and I think we got it then.
Right. No, those must have
Yeah.
been great fun days. And I have this
It
lovely
was.
vision now of Shirley, this respectable speaker of the house.
Oh,
whom I'm
yes.
very fond of, actually.
I really liked him. Yeah, he had a great
But reading
sense of
Bulldog
humor.
Drummond
Yes.
in his seaside fastness.
Yeah.
Tell me something about the rooms. What sort of, I mean, obviously these were holiday homes, but in the houses you lived in, say,
Yes.
Reed Avenue, for instance, what were the rooms like?
Well, I was thinking of Norma's, my godmother and aunt,
Yeah.
and her husband Herbert was also a very senior civil servant.
Yes, he
So
was governor
they
of the
had
bank, I
the
think. Yeah.
government bungalow in Norelia,
Right.
which was enormous, and of course it had to be haunted.
Right.
So nobody wanted to be alone in that house.
Hmm.
So-
But Auntie
so-
Norma would have dealt with any ghost
Oh,
very
she could
firmly.
have dealt with any.
Yes.
She could have dealt with anything, but I absolutely would not go into a room that didn't have someone sitting there.
No, I
who was
remember those rooms
absolutely
in
sane.
Norelia. I mean,
Yeah.
I once stayed in a government bungalow, what was called General's House.
Yes.
Just echoing corridors and, dark corridors. So when you
Yes.
went to your room, you were a bit nervous.
And all kinds of stories that had come up about lovelorn maidens throwing themselves, that was in Trinco, throwing themselves into
Oh, yes, yes,
the
into the sea,
ocean.
right.
And
Yes.
yeah.
And what
Yeah.
was Reed Avenue like, the rooms there?
Oh,
Because, of
Reed.
course, it was your mother, your father,
Yeah.
you and your brother. And then you also had your aunt, whom I was very fond of, your mother's
Yes.
sister.
Yes.
So they
Well,
had
these
enough room for all
houses
of
were
them?
so enormous. I would think that my bedroom was 4 times the size of this room. at
Really?
least.
Gosh, yeah.
And it had its own balcony, its own stairway. My brother had a sort of almost a little apartment behind. But when some of our friends were leaving, Steve Dasanayake, he was Sri Lankan, married to an English woman, and there was some change going on after independence. Some Britishers wanted to go home, and we lent them a part of our house for a year for nothing while they packed up, because the house was made for flexibility.
So they were there as well, and
They were there, and they
your
were a
aunt
whole
had her own
family.
place? Your
My aunt had her own place, we had our own place, and the party, and our house was right across from the race course. So we had parties anyway for the winners and losers.
One of the problems, though, of such wonderful accommodation when you were an official
Yeah,
is that both your father and my grandfather left building their own houses a bit late.
they did.
I know my grandfather, maybe, fortunately the wrong word, but because he fell ill and had to move to Colombo permanently, had been government agent in Anuradhapura and so on, he did build a house, and I'm fortunate enough to still live in that house, which was started in 1937.
Which one was that?
Lakmahal. It was
Oh,
built in
Lakmahal was
1937,
37,
where I
yeah.
now live. But I think the house that your mother lived in, Roshanara, was only built in the mid-50s, when your father would have been about 50.
Yeah.
And I think sadly and tragically, at the height of his career, he died very suddenly.
Very suddenly, yeah.
So, but he had at least set a house in place.
Yeah. Yes, it was hard, moving from the excessive luxury. Now one looks at it a little bit with a sense of guilt.
Right. Yes.
Because we didn't understand what poverty was. You see, the cultures were so different. I don't think people in the West understand. They know we had servants, and they equate servants with slaves. But yours and mine, they became part of the family. We supported the village. The people came from the village to work, and they loved it. We supported the children, many of whom went on to become nurses and doctors. I mean, there was a kind of reciprocal relationship that the system depended on.
I mean, I think I've been lucky in that, my grandfather died, and then my grandmother, my father was able to continue with this, so that in
Right.
fact we still have the
Of
children of our former staff.
Yeah.
But it must have been very tough for your mother when your father suddenly died.
Yes.
And she had to handle everything herself. And I think you were in Cambridge by then, weren't
I
you?
was in Cambridge by then. And then, I mean, what my father, with his good salary and his position, could support a village. He sent those children to school. He bought those uniforms, and many of the householders, like your family and mine, did that.
That's for the families of our staff.
Yeah.
But your mother wouldn't have been
She
in a position
wouldn't.
to
No.
do that.
No, she couldn't.
And it must have been very tough
It was
for
very
her.
hard for her. And in fact, for the people who had worked for us, because they were devoted to us as we were to them.
And she presumably had to downsize considerably.
Oh yes, she had just the one person.
Because when I knew her well, as it were, I would meet you on and off because you married. I think I may have gone to your wedding.
Yeah.
No, or maybe when you came back after the wedding. But I remember vividly you and David. But
Yeah.
I think your brother was away by then.
Yes, he was.
And
Yeah.
it was just your mother and your aunt.
Yeah.
Living in this very pleasant house.
Yes.
But I think they just had one staff.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, transition must have been very tough.
For them, yes, and they were alone. But my mother, she had that accident which changed her life
That
completely.
was, of course, 20 years later. And
20
that
years
was a
later.
tragedy, yes.
When she was knocked down by the motorcycle, and
Yeah.
she was in a coma for 6 weeks. But it showed me, I had been living then in the West, and supports in the West are great because we have paid our taxes for them.
Right.
They come promptly and they come well. But here I was in Sri Lanka, and my mother has a frightful accident. I don't even know whether she had any insurance. I don't think that was something that was there. But do you know that within half an hour of her having the injections, the relatives had formed a prayer circle. The relatives had formed a feeding circle. And all that nursing could not provide in Sri Lanka was willingly and happily and immediately taken up by the people in the hospital.
No, I remember that, because your mother was a great friend of mine when I was a
I know
youngster.
she
And I
was.
used to go and sort of, borrow her books and so on, and she taught me French and so on.
Yes.
And then when I came back from university, she was this great companion because she really had a wonderfully young mind, and we
Yes.
could talk about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, after a particularly vital conversation I remember with her, she had this accident,
Yeah.
and she was never the same again.
No. No.
But I think you're right because, Auntie Norma and all her sisters rallied round.
Yes.
But of course, what your mother was luckiest about was her sister, Rani.
Oh, yes, they were devoted to each other.
And they'd lived together all their lives. And Rani, I think, just sat by her hospital bed while she was in hospital.
And walked her meals to her because she had to be fed nasally.
Right.
So she had to make the food in the house, she had to beat it up, and then she had to carry all that paraphernalia to feed my mother. I don't know, I admire the efficiency of what I see in the West. But what I saw in the East at that time was just,
It was a
it was
system of support. And I think although, it was very sad not having your mother, this vibrant person she'd been before, she was still very lively, still very appreciative
yes.
of things. And the house, the quieter, I missed the parties, I missed she used to have a dog's party, I think, soon after
I
came back
remember
from
that.
Oxford. She had a birthday party for her dog.
with the candles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So but there was 10 years or 15 years of liveliness there.
Yeah.
But then, as they got older, I think your brother moved in and the house became crowded and it was difficult for them. And, those books, which had been so valuable a part of the house,
Yeah.
they faded away from sight because, brother didn't really welcome visitors.
And thank God for you, because having disappeared, been neglected, been half-eaten, a lot of them. You have rescued that entire library.
No, when
And I'll never be able
your
to
brother
thank you
died,
for
and
it.
then you became the inheritor of this.
Yeah.
I had to go there and clean it up. But the books, I mean, you wanted to recompense me, and I said, Sean, you don't need to recompense me because this cornucopia of books.
Yeah.
And I've got lots of them at home now, and they've given me so much pleasure over the years. But leaving aside all the adventurous books that you and I loved, I think what was also remarkable was the great range of art books.
Yes, she did.
And
yeah.
your mother studied this, when she became a painter.
Yes.
This-
she
this-
had a lively mind, didn't she?
Lively mind, and
She
she
never gave up
absolutely
with-
picked up everything about the world. So the French books, the art books, and you sort of realize that here had been this model wife of a civil servant. Then after he died, she created a life of her own.
Yes.
And lots of young people I knew, later younger than me, said they just remember that house in Flower Road and going in to learn French,
Yeah.
and admiring her paintings.
Yes, I think it was her breadth of vision and the fact that she was not going to give up. I remember the doctors told her this was the end as far as walking was concerned. And she said, watch me. And as you know, she got up off that bed and walked.
No, it was marvelous. And
It
as
was
you said, the younger
absolutely
people
marvelous, yeah.
who gathered round her,
Yeah.
she was eternally young. And even after the accident, people felt for her. And I think that legacy is what I knew best, because I never knew your father.
No.
And I think that was the spirit that was so strong and that you have continued in you.
Well, I hope so. Not as good as my mother, but getting there. But Raja, you must also remember, the first Prime Minister was a Sri Lankan woman, the first woman Prime Minister.
And the housewife who took over.
And the housewife who took
So
over.
the same way, I think that spirit was
I think that whole thing
remarkable.
about Sri Lankans is something to be investigated, because we did lead the world in many ways.
Well,
in the
let's hope that
innovations.
our discussions go somewhere towards
Right.
establishing what this background was. Thank you,
Yeah.
Shant.
You're welcome. That's very enjoyable.